Welcome to Bedtime Sleepy. Pull up a chair, this one's a quiet one. The smell hit before anything else. Wood smoke from 1,000 morning fires, drifting low over the rooftops before the sun had cleared the horizon. Horse manure thick in the unpaved streets. 9 million horses working across the country in 1870, each one contributing daily to an accumulation no city government had figured out how to handle. Behind that came the tanneries, the slaughterhouses, the rivers that served as drinking sources and dumping grounds at the same time, for a population growing too fast to think carefully about what it was leaving behind. And underneath all of it, something sweet and faintly wrong. The smell of wells too close to outhouses, of food preservation that had almost worked, of a country moving too quickly to clean up after itself. This was America in 1870, not the myth, the actual country. 38.5 million people called the United States home that year. Nearly 4 million of them had been legally enslaved less than a decade before. A transcontinental railroad had been hammered into existence just the previous year, but most Americans would never ride it. Life expectancy at birth hovered around 40 years, pulled down in large part by the fact that more than a third of all children born wouldn't survive to see their 5th birthday. The average American adult worked 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, for wages that couldn't quite keep pace with rising food costs. And the 15th Amendment, ratified in February of that very year, had just granted black men the constitutional right to vote, a revolution on paper that was already being quietly dismantled on the ground in ways most white northerners preferred not to examine too closely. This wasn't a simpler time, it wasn't a quieter world. It was a country inside an industrial transformation so fast and so total that the people living through it couldn't see its full shape, only its pressure, only the particular corner of it pressing on their own lives every morning when they woke up before dawn, started the fire, and tried to figure out how to make it through another day. Mary Halleck was 23 years old in 1870, renting a room in a New York City boarding house and earning her living as a professional illustrator. She'd trained at the Cooper Union School of Design for Women, one of a handful of institutions in the country willing to take female artistic talent seriously enough to develop it. She was good at her work, better than good. She had the kind of precise, emotionally intelligent draftsmanship that editors at major literary magazines paid real attention to. She was engaged to a civil engineer named Arthur Foote, whom she loved, and her combination of talent and a stable relationship gave her a foothold most women in 1870 couldn't access. By almost any measure available at the time, she was among the more fortunate young women in America. What strikes me most is that she still couldn't open a bank account without a male cosigner. She couldn't vote. If the marriage soured, the law would in most states give her husband custody of their children. Her income would become legally his the moment the vows were spoken, and the culture around her treated this arrangement not as an injustice, but as common sense. This is the world we're about to enter together. Not the commemorative version, not the lithographs of rolling prairies and sturdy farmhouses and men with their gazes fixed on the western horizon. The actual world, crowded and dirty and unequal and medically terrifying, and occasionally, in moments nobody could plan for, genuinely magnificent. If you're settling in tonight and you want something that holds your attention without asking you to perform an emotion you don't actually feel, this history might be exactly what you came for. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is a quiet moment to do that. Then make yourself comfortable, because what follows is worth staying for all the way to the end. What did everyday life actually look like in 1870 America? Not for the Vanderbilts, not for the people who appear in history books because they had the power and resources to make sure their names stayed legible to the future. for the Irish immigrant woman scrubbing hotel floors in Boston for 75 cents a day, for the 10-year-old boy already working in a Pennsylvania coal mine with a cough that had a name among the miners, black lung, and a trajectory everyone around him understood, even if no one said it out loud. For the freedman in South Carolina who'd registered to vote, walked to the polling place, and been turned away at gunpoint, and then gone home and made supper for his children because the sun still set and they were still hungry, and there was still tomorrow. This isn't a simple story. It's not a triumph narrative, the kind that leaves you feeling proud and warm and safely distant from the difficulties it describes. And it's not a pure condemnation either, the kind that flattens complicated human beings into symbols of a shameful past we'd like to believe we've left behind. The people who lived in 1870 America weren't symbols. They were people, exhausted and hopeful and occasionally heroic, and frequently just trying to get through the week without losing too much of what they had built. They were making choices inside constraints they hadn't chosen, building lives from materials they hadn't selected, navigating a world as bewildering and demanding and occasionally beautiful as any world that has existed before or since. And those lives, in aggregate, built the country that exists right now, not as metaphor, as literal, material fact. The roads, the habits of thought, the legal structures, the unresolved arguments. A significant portion of what shapes American life today was set in motion in 1870, or in the years immediately surrounding it. The choices that seemed like local temporary accommodations turned out to be foundational. The injustices described as regrettable but unavoidable turned out to have very long tails. The possibilities foreclosed in 1870 stayed foreclosed for decades, in some cases for more than a century. Most people don't realize how directly the arguments happening in this country right now trace back to the arguments that were already running in 1870. Who gets counted? Who gets protected? Who gets heard? And who gets left to manage on their own? Those questions didn't get answered in 1870. They got deferred, bargained with, negotiated down into something that seemed manageable, and then turned out not to be manageable at all. They went underground and came back up wearing different clothes, using different vocabulary, but carrying the same weight they'd always carried. What was everyday life really like in 1870 America? The question sounds simple. The answer is an entire country, not an idea of one, not a symbol of one, not the country as it appears in the commemorative images of the era. The actual country. That's what we're here to find. And it starts, as nearly everything in 1870 America did, before the sun comes up. The alarm was a rooster, or a neighbour's rooster, or the sound of someone else in the boarding house starting the fire downstairs, the clatter of a cast-iron stove door echoing through thin walls. In January 1870, across the rural stretches of this country, still nearly 3/4 of all Americans living outside of cities, you woke up in a room that had dropped to the same temperature as the outdoors during the night. Because that's what happened when the fire went out. The first task of every winter morning wasn't coffee. It wasn't dressing. It was fire. Searching for embers still glowing in the hearth if you were lucky. Striking flint if you weren't. Feeding dry kindling to a small and uncertain flame, while your breath made fog in the air and your fingers moved slowly and you had livestock to tend before any thought of breakfast. Most Americans in 1870 were up before 5 in the morning, not because they were unusually virtuous or disciplined, but because the work required it. And the work was the whole thing. Without electric light, without gas lamps in most homes, without any reliable way to extend the productive day, you worked with the light. On the farm, that meant being in the barn before sunup in winter, hauling water from a well that might have a thin sheet of ice on it, spreading feed, checking on animals that may have made it through the night, or may not have. In cities, Factory whistles blew at 6 for shifts that ran until 6 in the evening, with 30 minutes for the noon meal, which you might spend sitting on a crate eating cold bread, or skipping entirely if the pace of the machinery didn't allow it. Breakfast in 1870. America wasn't a small or optional meal for most people. The caloric demands of sustained physical labour required a morning foundation that could carry the body through what the day was going to ask of it. On farms, that meant salt pork and cornmeal porridge and potatoes fried in lard. Perhaps eggs from the chickens who'd managed to lay despite the cold. All of it cooked over an open fire or cast-iron wood stove by whoever in the household held that responsibility, which was almost always a woman, and almost always before anyone else was fully dressed. The smell of that breakfast, smoky fat and charred potato skin, and the hot grain scent of cornmeal, filled the house for hours after the meal itself was gone, settling into the wood of the walls and the wool of the clothing hanging on the pegs near the door. City breakfasts were different, and frequently worse. Working poor families in New York, Boston, Chicago and Philadelphia often lived in tenement rooms without cooking facilities, or in boarding houses where meals were included in the rent and prepared from the cheapest possible ingredients. Dense rye bread with butter or molasses, weak coffee that was often half chicory, occasionally a piece of salt fish or a boiled egg. This was the fuel most of America's industrial workforce carried into a 10-hour shift, carried it in bodies already worn down by chronic overwork and inadequate nutrition, into workplaces that were loud, physically dangerous and entirely without regulatory oversight. Water was a problem everywhere, in different ways. In rural areas it came from wells or streams, and the distance between the well and the outhouse was a matter of life and death that was only truly understood in retrospect, when the germ theory of disease finally filtered from European laboratories into American medical practice. Typhoid fever, cholera and dysentery weren't historical abstractions in 1870. They were seasonal visitors, more reliable than certain crops, and more dangerous to children than nearly anything else in their environment. Cities had water systems, but those systems couldn't keep pace with the populations they served. Quality varied enormously by neighbourhood, which also meant by income and by the ethnicity of the people living there. A household in a prosperous district of New York might have reasonably clean-piped water in the kitchen. A family in a 5 Points tenement was drawing from a shared courtyard pump, serving 100 people, last inspected nobody could remember when. The workday itself, for most Americans, had a physical reality that's genuinely difficult to hold from this distance. Farmers in 1870 didn't simply grow food, they manufactured almost everything they consumed. The farm wife of that era was running what amounted to a small production operation out of her kitchen, turning raw ingredients into preserved foods, raw wool into cloth, cloth into clothing, managing a food supply that had to carry the household from one harvest to the next, with no grocery store, no refrigeration, no canned goods from a factory. She was doing all of this while also raising children, nursing the sick, assisting at births with whatever help the neighbourhood could offer, and working the fields alongside the men during the seasons that demanded it. The word housework doesn't come close to describing what this was. Factory life had its own physical language. In the textile mills of New England, the air was thick with floating cotton fibre. Workers breathed it all day, and over years it settled in the lungs in ways that produced what doctors of the era called brown lung, a slow deterioration with no treatment and a predictable ending. The noise inside those mills was constant and staggering. Hundreds of looms running at once, louder than almost anything most people in the modern world encounter regularly. Workers communicated in shouts, or in the sign language they'd developed among themselves for an environment that never stopped roaring. They stood for the entire shift, or bent over machinery at angles that produced chronic back pain within months. Accidents were common, and liability was essentially a concept that existed in legal theory, not in the lives of workers who'd lost fingers or hands to machines running too fast to outrun. Children worked in 1870. This wasn't a disturbing footnote. It was a structural feature of the economy, broadly accepted and legally permitted. The 1870 census recorded more than 750,000 children between the ages of 10 and 15 in industrial employment. Coal mines used boys as young as 8 as breaker boys, sitting hunched over coal sorting chutes for 10 hours at a stretch, separating rock from coal with bare hands that bled in cold weather and were never entirely clean. Textile mills employed girls as young as 10 as doorfers, replacing bobbins on spinning frames in tight spaces where small bodies could move quickly through machinery that could catch a small hand in ways that ended badly. These weren't aberrations that decent people were fighting to prevent. They were the normal operation of an economy that had made its calculations about whose welfare mattered. Evening in 1870 fell hard and early. By the time most working Americans had finished their labour, walked home or completed the outdoor chores, and eaten their evening meal, usually a reheated version of whatever had been cooked earlier, or a plain preparation of dried beans and salt meat, there was very little light remaining. Candles and oil lamps were expensive enough that most households used them sparingly. You sat close to the lamp to sew or read or write a letter home. Children who had attended school at all. And in 1870, attendance was irregular, partial, and in much of the country racially segregated or simply unavailable, might do their lessons by firelight. Then, because the body insisted on it, early to bed. The calendar moved differently in 1870 than it does now. Without artificial light stretching the productive hours, without the ability to preserve food beyond what canning and smoking and salting could manage, seasons weren't decorative, they were structural. Summer meant long days in the fields and gardens, the slow building of surplus. Fall meant harvest and frantic preparation, canning, pickling, smoking meat, cutting and stacking firewood, winterizing every structure that needed to survive the cold. Winter meant a relative slowdown on the farm, but also the quiet risk of running out, of food, of fuel, of medical supplies, of money, before spring arrived. Spring meant mud, and in rural America, mud meant roads became impassable for weeks at a time, cutting communities off from towns and markets and each other. The smell of these seasons was specific, in the way that things are specific when the body is outdoors for most of every day. Summer smelled like cut hay and river mud and animal heat. Fall smelled like wood smoke and pickling vinegar and the sharp, sweet ferment of cider apples. Winter smelled like wet wool and tallow candles and the contained warmth of too many people in too small a room. Spring smelled like thaw, like the earth releasing winter's compression, like mud and meltwater and green things beginning again in soil that had been frozen hard since November. These weren't background details, they were the texture of the lived time, the way seasons announced themselves to people who hadn't yet been separated from them. This was the world most Americans lived inside in 1870. Not a simpler world, not a slower world in the way that phrase is usually meant, with nostalgia, as if pace itself were a form of grace, a harder world, a physically demanding, medically precarious, economically marginal world in which the distance between stability and catastrophe was often a single bad harvest, a single illness, a single accident that nobody had the insurance to survive. And yet people loved each other in it. They made music in it. They wrote letters full of wit and careful observation and real longing. They built institutions, churches, schools, mutual aid societies, from whatever was available, which was often very little. They endured things that would finish most of us. And some of them, looking at the world they'd been handed, decided it wasn't enough, and that the deciding mattered. That's where this story starts to get complicated. The newsprint was faintly damp in the cold morning air, the smell of fresh ink sharp against the wood smoke. Even in 1870, with the ink barely dry on the decade following the Civil War, Americans were already building the mythology of a simpler past. The dime novels selling by the hundreds of thousands were set on a frontier already receding westward. Politicians invoked a bucolic America of self-reliant yeoman farmers as the moral baseline of national character. The myth of 1870 was being assembled in real time by the very people living inside it, and the effect was to make that actual year feel like a departure from something purer, which it wasn't, because nothing purer had ever existed. Here's the myth most people still carry about 1870 America. Life was harder physically, yes, but it was simpler. There was clarity to it, rootedness, a sense of community and shared purpose that the modern world has slowly worn away. People knew their neighbours, they knew where their food came from, they ate real food and did real work and were consequently healthier. They were self-reliant in ways that built genuine character. And underneath all of it, there was a moral seriousness, a work ethic, a faith, a commitment to family that we've somehow misplaced in the century and a half since. Almost none of this holds up to examination. Start with health. In 1870, tuberculosis, called consumption then, because it appeared to consume the body from within, killed approximately 1 in 7 Americans. Not 1 in 7 who contracted it. 1 in 7 Americans, period. Making it the single leading cause of death in the country. It killed slowly and publicly and horribly, the body growing progressively thinner and more translucent over months or years, the cough deepening and then turning wet and then turning bloody, the patient declining in ways that everyone around them watched and could do nothing to reverse. There was no effective treatment. There was no cure. There was isolation in sanatoriums for those who could afford them, or at home for those who couldn't, where the disease moved quietly through every person who shared air and space with the dying. Beyond tuberculosis, the infectious disease landscape of 1870 would be genuinely unrecognisable to anyone who's grown up in the antibiotic era. Typhoid fever, cholera, scarlet fever, diphtheria, smallpox. These weren't historical curiosities. They were recurring seasonal events, killing children with particular thoroughness. A family in 1870 might reasonably expect to bury 2 or 3 of their children before those children reached adulthood. This wasn't exceptional. It was the actuarial baseline. The large families visible in the photographs of that era weren't simply the product of religious conviction or economic calculation, though both played a role. They were also the product of a grim and accurate arithmetic, parents who understood that not all of these children would survive, and that more children gave a better probability that some of them would. The food that supposedly made 1870 Americans healthier was, for most of the population, monotonous, nutritionally narrow, and dangerously incomplete during the winter months. The image of the groaning harvest table was real, for some families in some seasons. For most working Americans, in cities, in the rural South, in immigrant communities wherever they'd settled, the diet was a rotation of salt meat, dried beans, cornmeal, and whatever the kitchen garden could produce before the first frost. Fruits and vegetables were deeply seasonal, absent for long stretches, and the deficiencies that followed were widespread enough to have their own clinical names. Pellagra from niacin deficiency, scurvy from lack of vitamin C through the winter months, rickets in children who didn't get enough sunlight or calcium. These weren't exotic conditions. They were the ordinary consequences of an ordinary American diet. The myth of the self-made man, arguably the most durable American invention fully formed by 1870, deserves particular scrutiny. The story, as the Horatio Alger novels being published in exactly this period, told it hundreds of times with minor variations. A young man of humble origins through hard work, moral virtue, and a timely hand from a wealthy benefactor rises to respectability and prosperity. The formula sold extraordinarily well. It was also as an accurate description of how American social mobility actually functioned in 1870, nearly entirely fictional. Mobility was possible, but it was far more constrained by geography, family of origin, and racial category than the mythology ever acknowledged. A farmer's son in Kansas was almost certainly going to be a farmer. A factory worker's son in Pennsylvania was overwhelmingly more likely to become a factory worker than a factory owner. The rare exceptions were celebrated with an intensity precisely proportional to their rarity, and that celebration served the useful function of making the system appear more open than it was. For Black Americans, the self-made man narrative was something worse than fictional. It was actively insulting. A black man in 1870 could be exceptionally talented, hard-working, and upright by any available measure, and still be legally barred from most professions in most states, excluded from nearly all educational institutions above the most basic level, denied equal access to transportation, housing, and public accommodation, and subjected to lethal violence if he accumulated enough wealth to make white neighbors uncomfortable. Frederick Douglass had made himself in every sense the myth intended. He was one of the most gifted writers and orators in American public life, and he still couldn't eat in most of the restaurants in the cities where he lectured. The self-made man was a white man. That wasn't a footnote to the myth. It was the myth's operating definition. The idea of community in 1870 America is more complicated because there's genuine truth in it that makes the complications harder to see. Yes, rural Americans in 1870 were more physically dependent on their neighbors than most Americans are today. Barn raisings were real. Harvest cooperatives were real. Mutual aid societies, many of them organized by immigrant communities, by black churches, by women's benevolent associations, were real, and they mattered deeply. But that same community also enforced its own norms with a thoroughness that made deviation extremely costly. A woman who left an abusive husband was largely without legal or social protection. A family with a mentally ill member, or a child born outside of marriage, or a history of bankruptcy carried stigmas enforced by gossip and exclusion with a consistency that modern social life, for all its genuine cruelties, rarely matches. And the moral seriousness the myth attributes to 1870 America. The work ethic was real, in the sense that not working hard meant genuine catastrophe. The faith was genuine for many people, and churches were the central social institution in most communities. But that moral seriousness had sharp limits. It didn't extend to the labour conditions grinding up children in coal mines. It didn't extend to the treatment of Native American nations in the West, whose dispossession from their lands was accelerating in 1870 with the full backing of the federal government and the US Army. It didn't extend to the organised political violence dismantling Reconstruction across the South, which was widely known and largely tolerated by the segment of American society with the power to stop it. A moral seriousness with those particular blind spots isn't moral seriousness. It's selective moral attention, which is a very different thing. Here's the counterintuitive truth. 1870. America wasn't simpler, it wasn't healthier, it wasn't more virtuous. It was in many measurable ways more physically brutal, more economically precarious, and more morally inconsistent than the world we inhabit right now. What it genuinely was what makes it worth studying and worth taking seriously, was a place of extraordinary human adaptability. People developed remarkable capacities for endurance and improvisation in response to conditions they couldn't change. That adaptability gets misread through the soft focus of historical distance as simplicity or virtue. It wasn't either. It was survival, practiced with more skill and less complaint than most of us could manage in comparable circumstances. The myth of 1870. America isn't just historically inaccurate. It actively distorts our understanding of the present because it functions as retroactive endorsement of conditions that the people who actually lived in them would not have chosen, did not romanticize, and in many cases organized against with everything they had. The workers building early labor unions in the 1870s weren't ungrateful for the supposed blessings of a simpler life. They were telling the truth about conditions that were genuinely terrible. The women fighting for suffrage weren't destroying something that was working. They were demanding entry to a system that had explicitly excluded them. What remains, after the myth breaks, is something more interesting and more honest. The actual record of how ordinary people lived, what they tried to change, and why the trying mattered more than they knew at the time. The light came through a single east-facing window, and Mary Hallock had learned to build her whole day around it. Her room on East 15th Street in Manhattan was small, maybe 12 feet by 15, enough for a bed, a washstand, a chair, and the drawing table she'd angled to catch the best of the morning. Without good natural light, precise wood engraving wasn't possible, and precision was everything she was building toward. She worked with a baron, a small steel tool with a mushroom-shaped wooden handle, gripped between the thumb and first two fingers, pulled slowly across the surface of a boxwood block. Each groove she carved would hold ink. Each line would carry an image onto paper. That was her art. It asked for good eyes, a steady hand, and the kind of quiet, solitary focus that shuts the world out and leaves only the work in front of you. She'd built that focus at the Cooper Union School of Design for Women, where she studied through the late 1860s. The Cooper Union had opened in 1859 with a clear commitment: no tuition, free to anyone, regardless of wealth or background. The Women's Design School was part of that promise. It was one of the very few places in the country where a young woman could receive serious technical training in the arts without having to make the seriousness smaller than it was. The coursework was demanding. The instructors were working professionals. Students were expected to produce work that could hold its own commercially, because the expectation at the heart of the whole program, radical for its time, was that most of them would have to earn a living through their art. Mary did exactly that. By 1870, she was contributing illustrations to Scribner's Monthly, one of the most respected literary magazines in the country, and to books from several of the major New York houses. Her work appeared alongside prose by some of the best-known writers of the era. It held up. She had a particular gift for the human figure in everyday settings: women at work, children at play, landscapes caught in specific light at specific times of day. But beyond technical skill, her images had something else: a point of view. You could feel that someone was looking at the world she drew, not simply rendering it. That quality, the artist's own intelligence present in the finished work, was what made editors ask for her by name. In the early 1870s, she was also tending to what she'd later call the defining friendship of her life. Helena Decay was a painter, a year older than Mary, and they'd found each other at the Cooper Union with the particular relief of two people who'd been talking mostly to themselves and had finally found someone who truly listened. Their letters, maintained across decades and thousands of miles, run into the hundreds. They're among the most vivid records we have of what it meant to be educated, ambitious, and artistically serious as a woman in 19th century America. They talked about their work with an honesty they couldn't always show elsewhere. They talked about love, marriage, and what those things asked of women. They talked about books, painters they admired, and the distance between the life they wanted and the life that was actually available to them. What did Mary want? It's worth sitting with that question, because the answer isn't simple. She wanted her work to be genuinely good, not good with an unspoken qualifier, not good for a woman, but good in the absolute sense that sent editors her work regardless of anything else. She wanted her engagement to Arthur Foote to become a marriage that held both of them up without erasing either one. And she wanted, in some form she couldn't quite put into words without sounding naive or dangerous, to stay fully herself after the wedding. That wasn't as guaranteed as it sounds. The legal doctrine of coverture, still in effect across most American states in 1870, meant that a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. Her contracts, her debts, her earnings, legally his. In the eyes of most courts, she'd ceased to exist as an independent legal actor. Mary understood this clearly. She wrote about it in her letters to Helena, not in the language of the organised resistance, not in the rhetoric of the suffragists, but in a personal, honest, slightly rueful voice. The voice of a woman who'd made a careful accounting of what marriage in 1870 was likely to cost her, and who'd decided she still wanted to marry Arthur, and to lose as little of herself as possible in the process. It wasn't a political programme, it was a private negotiation with an unjust arrangement, carried out with quiet intelligence and with no real option to simply walk away from the arrangement itself. Her daily life had the rhythm of a working artist navigating a city that was, all at once, one of the most electric places in the world to be alive and one of the most exhausting. Most mornings she was at the drawing table, the burin moving slowly across the boxwood block in lines so fine they were nearly invisible on their own, but built together into images of real weight and clarity. She sent finished blocks to magazine engraving departments by messenger. She collected payment, tracked assignments, managed the business side of her practice with the cool professionalism of someone who had no safety net and had never pretended otherwise. The money wasn't lavish. It was enough. Enough for the room, the table, the tools, the small dignified life she had assembled around her work. Afternoons sometimes brought visits to Helena's family studio across the city, or meetings with editors to talk through upcoming commissions. The New York art world of the early 1870s was small enough that most of its significant figures knew each other, and Mary moved through it with the ease of someone who had been taken seriously and had learned to take herself seriously in return. She had opinions about other people's work. She said them plainly. That directness occasionally surprised people who expected more deference from a young woman in a field where young women were still relatively new. But it came from the same place as her precision, from years of working alone on things she genuinely cared about, without needing to perform enthusiasm she didn't feel. The evenings were the hardest part. Not because they were difficult in any practical way. The boarding house provided dinner. There was company when she wanted it. They were hard the way evenings are always hard for people with a great deal of interior life and too much unstructured time to feel the weight of everything they want and don't yet have. She was 23 years old, engaged to a man who spent much of his time far from New York, living in an extraordinary city in an extraordinary moment, and she was lonely, with a specific kind of loneliness that thoughtful women knew in that era. Not the absence of people, the absence of a place where her full self was both seen and welcome. Her letters from those years have something unforgettable about them, funny, observant, and occasionally heartbreaking in their precision. She writes about walking through Manhattan and noticing things, the quality of winter light on a particular block, the expression on a vendor's face at the end of a cold day, the way poverty and wealth in New York in 1870 were sometimes separated by nothing more than a single doorway. She was collecting these observations the way artists always do, not for any immediate use, but because the collecting itself was what it meant to be her. Someone who looked hard at the world and tried to be honest about what she saw. She'd stay in New York a few more years. In 1876, she'd marry Arthur and follow him west, to California, to a mining settlement in the hills south of San Jose, where the landscape was so unlike anything she'd known that she'd have to build an entirely new visual vocabulary for it. But that was still ahead of her. In 1870, she was in the boarding house room, at the drawing table, working in morning light toward a life she was constructing slowly, piece by careful piece, inside a world that was already producing pressures that would shape the next 100 years. She didn't know that yet. Almost nobody in 1870 did. But something was already shifting beneath the surface of ordinary life, something connected to power and money, and who got to decide the terms of other people's survival. And it was about to become very hard to ignore. Church bells rang across Washington, D.C. on the morning of February 3rd, 1870. The cold air carried the sound over muddy avenues, half-finished government buildings, and the neighborhoods where freed people had settled since the end of the war, building lives in a city that had itself been built in large part by enslaved hands. The bells marked something extraordinary: the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, the declaration that the right to vote couldn't be denied on account of race, colour, or previous condition of servitude. Depending on who you were and where you stood, it was either one of the most radical achievements in the history of democratic governance, or a half measure arriving 5 years too late, backed by too little force, and already being quietly dismantled by the people it threatened most. Both of those things were true, and understanding 1870 means holding them both at once, without letting either one cancel the other out. Reconstruction, the effort to remake the former Confederate states as working democracies that included freed black citizens as full members, was, in 1870, still nominally moving forward, and what it had produced in just 5 years was remarkable by any honest measure. Black men were serving in state legislatures across the South. Hiram Revels of Mississippi had been seated in March of that year as the first black United States senator in the nation's history, filling the very seat that Jefferson Davis had once occupied. Joseph Rainey of South Carolina became the first black man to serve in the House of Representatives. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were legislators, drafting bills, casting votes, representing constituents in ways that would have been not just illegal, but literally unthinkable 5 years before. The speed of that change was dizzying. Meanwhile, the black communities of the South were building with the focus and energy of people who had been given even a partial opening after a very long closure. In the 5 years since emancipation, more than 1,000 schools for black children and adults had been established across the South, many of them constructed with materials and labour contributed by the very communities they served. The Freedmen's Bureau, chronically underfunded and under political attack almost from the moment it was created, was still attempting to formalise labour contracts, settle disputes, and provide basic services to a population that had been systematically denied literacy, legal standing, and economic participation for generations. What the historical record often reduces to numbers, schools built, voters registered, officials elected, was, lived from the inside, the transformation of an entire world. A man who'd been enslaved getting up in the morning to go to work as a wage labourer, knowing the wages were legally his. A woman who'd had her children sold away from her searching across half a continent for those children, following whisper networks and rumour and the occasional newspaper, sometimes finding them, sometimes not. Children sitting at desks in newly built schoolrooms learning to read, in communities where literacy had been forbidden by law and enforced by violence for as long as anyone could remember. These weren't abstractions. They were the substance of a country trying to become something different from what it had been. And running underneath all of it, the terror. This is the hardest part of the perspective shift to sit with. The Ku Klux Klan had been founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865. By 1870, it was operating as a systematic campaign of political violence across the South, targeting black voters, black office holders, black community leaders and white allies, with a calculated brutality that its architects understood as a political project. The goal was the dismantling by force of exactly the structures Reconstruction had made possible. The methods were murder, arson, mutilation, and assault, not random, but strategic, aimed at specific individuals who represented specific threats to the restoration of white supremacist political control. In 1871, Congress would pass the Ku Klux Klan Act, and federal forces would be deployed in response. But in 1870, the violence was operating largely without federal interference, and the people it targeted had almost nowhere to turn for protection that would actually arrive in time to matter. What that meant for everyday life in black Southern communities was a world where extraordinary possibility and mortal danger existed in the exact same day, sometimes in the exact same hour. A man could cast a ballot in the morning and find his house in flames by evening. A school teacher could teach all week and spend Sunday receiving word that a colleague in the next county had been beaten for refusing to stop. The people who lived in this world weren't broken by it. The historical record of what they built in this period is far too remarkable to support that reading. But they weren't naive either. They understood, with a precision that required no special wisdom, only the ongoing evidence of their own experience, that the rights they were exercising were simultaneously real and fragile, and that the men who wanted those rights back were neither few in number nor hesitant about their intentions. This is the perspective shift that most accounts of 1870 America quietly move around. The most consequential drama unfolding in America that year was happening to and among black Americans. A story of freedom, resistance, and organized betrayal that was the direct inheritance of the Civil War and the direct forerunner of 100 years of Jim Crow. When we talk about everyday life in 1870 as if it were a single shared experience, as if there were one American of 1870 with one coherent relationship to the country and its promises, we're describing the white American experience and calling it the American experience, which is precisely what most of the people with the power to write history in 1870 did. And it's worth stopping to say that plainly. The everyday life of a black farmer in South Carolina in 1870 wasn't the same country as the everyday life of a white farmer in Ohio. They shared a calendar, a currency, and a constitution. They didn't share a legal reality, a physical safety, an economic horizon, or any honest relationship to what that constitution actually delivered in practice. Understanding 1870 means holding that not as a footnote to the main story, but as a central structural fact. The country was one country, with at least two radically different lived realities, and the decisions being made in 1870 about which of those realities would persist were going to shape American life for the next 100 years. Frederick Douglass was 52 years old in 1870. He was editing his newspaper in Washington, watching the 15th Amendment ratified with a hope that was real and carefully guarded at the same time. He'd spent more than 30 years fighting for exactly this constitutional moment. He knew what it had cost, in years, in labour, in the lives of people who hadn't lived to see it. He also knew, because he'd been watching this country long enough to read its patterns, that a constitutional guarantee and an actual guarantee were two very different things. and that the gap between them was where the real fight would be. He was right. He knew he was right while he was writing it. That knowledge, accurate, clear-eyed, and not enough to stop what it could already see coming, is one of the defining emotional experiences of Black American public life, not just in 1870. In many years that followed, the perspective shift isn't only about race, though race was the most consequential line dividing American life in that era. Women without property rights were counted as citizens, but excluded from nearly all legal protections and every form of political participation. Chinese immigrants who'd built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad were being driven out of mining camps and railroad towns by white workers afraid of a wage competition. In violence, the authorities weren't rushing to stop. Native American nations across the West were fighting for physical survival and cultural continuity against a federal policy of forced removal and deliberate destruction that was accelerating in 1870 with military backing. None of these experiences were peripheral, they were central, constitutive of what America actually was in 1870 and what it was in the process of becoming. The question is always whether the story we tell includes the people being lived through, or whether we keep adjusting the frame until they quietly disappear. In 1870, the people doing the adjusting had enormous resources and every institutional reason to keep adjusting. But they were already being resisted by those being edited out, and by a smaller number of people within the mainstream who understood what the editing was costing. That resistance was happening in churches and newspaper offices, in legislative chambers and boarding house rooms, in schoolrooms, farm kitchens and labour meeting halls, all at once, in the same country, in the same year. What ran it, who it served, and what it was covering over, that was the hidden layer. And it was larger and more deliberate than most people living inside it ever fully understood. The factory whistle blew at 6 in the morning, and you heard it whether you wanted to or not. In the mill towns of New England, in the coal regions of Pennsylvania, in the industrial corridors spreading across the Midwest and into the Upper South. That whistle was the organizing principle of daily life in a way that had no real precedent in American history. It was the sound of the industrial economy asserting authority over human time, announcing when your day began, when you could eat, when your day ended. There was no negotiating with the whistle, no seasonal flexibility, no allowance for family emergency, no grace period for weather or sickness. You answered it, or you lost your position, and in 1870, there was always someone else desperate enough to take your place, because desperation was being produced at roughly the same rate as the goods. The numbers matter here. You need them to understand the pressure that was building, because the scale of economic inequality in 1870 wasn't a background condition. It was the defining political fact of the era. The wealthiest 1% of Americans owned more than a quarter of the country's total measurable wealth. The bottom half owned less than 2%. The railroads, which controlled not just transportation, but the economic development of entire regions, were operating as effectively unregulated private governments, setting freight rates that could break a farmer's entire annual income with decisions made in boardrooms the farmer would never come close to entering. Wages in industrial work hadn't kept pace with the cost of food for most of the decades since the Civil War. The gap between what workers produced and what they were paid for producing it kept widening year after year. And the people at the top of that system weren't losing any sleep over it. The Transcontinental Railroad, celebrated as a triumph of American will and engineering at its completion in May 1869, tells the real story of 1870 America in the details the commemorative photographs left out. The Central Pacific had been built primarily by Chinese immigrant labourers, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 of them at peak construction. They were paid roughly $26 a month while their white counterparts earned $35 for the same work. They received no housing. They were expected to provide their own food. They worked in conditions that killed men regularly. Avalanches in the Sierra Nevada, nitroglycerin explosions on sheer granite faces that required workers to hang in wicker baskets over cliff edges just to drill the holes for the charges. When they went on strike in 1867, demanding equal pay and an 8-hour workday in the tunnels, the company responded by cutting off their food supply. The strike broke. They went back to work on the original terms. The railroad was completed on schedule. Factory workers were organizing. The 8-hour workday movement had been building since the Civil War, finding new urgency in the industrial expansion of the late 1860s. Strikes were happening in New England textile mills, in Midwest railroad yards, in Pennsylvania mine shafts, and they were being broken, methodically, efficiently. Company guards, Pinkerton detectives hired by management, state militia called in by governors with financial ties to industrial interests. The tools of strike suppression were numerous and well practiced. Workers who organized were fired. Workers who were fired were blacklisted. Industrial employers in the same sector communicated with each other, kept lists of known union organizers, and made sure those men couldn't find comparable work anywhere in the region. The mechanisms of suppression were efficient. They had had time to practice. The immigrant experience in industrial America in 1870 was a specific kind of education, a close lesson in the gap between what the country said it was and what it actually offered. Immigration was reshaping the nation at a scale that made nativist politicians furious and industrial employers quietly satisfied. More workers meant lower wages. Lower wages meant higher returns on capital. The Irish, arriving in large numbers since the Great Famine of the 1840s, now occupied the lowest rungs of industrial and service work in eastern cities, performing labour that was physically brutal and socially invisible. Germans came in significant numbers too, bringing trade skills and a tradition of labour organising that would eventually become part of the intellectual foundation of the American labour movement. And Chinese workers, who'd built the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad in conditions nobody on the eastern seaboard was looking at too carefully, were being driven out of California mining camps and railroad towns by white workers who said they were protecting American wages. The company town deserves its own moment. In a company town, a single industrial employer owned not just the factory or mine, but the housing workers lived in, the stores where they bought food and clothing, sometimes even the church where they worshipped. Workers were often paid in scrip, tokens redeemable only at company-owned stores, at prices the company itself had set, with no competition to keep those prices honest. Whatever you earned, you spent back at the company store. Saving was nearly impossible, and if you lost your job in a company town, you lost your home at the same time. Labour organising in that kind of arrangement wasn't just economically risky, it was structurally impossible for most people trapped inside it. These weren't isolated experiments, they were recognised, copied business models across the coal country of Pennsylvania, the textile regions of the Carolinas, and the silver mining towns of the Rocky Mountain West. Women in the industrial workforce carried all of these conditions, plus one more layer on top of it. Female factory workers in 1870 earned roughly half what male workers in identical jobs were paid. This wasn't a controversial policy in any mainstream sense. It was accepted practice, explained with the confidence of people who didn't expect to be questioned. Women didn't need to support families. Women would marry and leave the workforce. Women were less physically capable. Every one of those justifications was contradicted daily by actual women working 12-hour shifts in conditions that wore down even strong adult bodies. And not one piece of that daily evidence changed anything. The wage gap wasn't a malfunction, it was a feature, keeping women economically dependent regardless of how hard they worked, which in turn sustained the broader structure of legal subordination the era's laws had carefully built. Children were still part of this workforce, and they're worth dwelling on in human terms, not just statistical ones. A 10-year-old boy working as a breaker boy in the anthracite coalfields of northeastern Pennsylvania started before 7 in the morning and finished after 5 in the evening. He sat hunched at a coal sorting chute, pulling rock and slate from the moving coal with his bare hands, breathing coal dust for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. His fingers bled in cold weather. They were never entirely clean. The foremen who supervised breaker boys weren't known for patience. The boy earned roughly 50 cents a day. His family needed it. There weren't any alternatives, and not a single person in that chain of authority, from the foreman to the mine operator to the distant owner in his office, was breaking a single existing law. This wasn't a failure of enforcement. It was the absence of the law itself. The economic pressure building in 1870 was also the beginning of something the era didn't yet have language for. The slow recognition that the industrial economy's benefits and costs weren't being distributed on any principle most Americans would have endorsed, if asked directly. The farmer who couldn't understand why freight rates kept rising, even as crop prices stayed flat, didn't know about the informal agreements between railroad companies that functioned as cartels. The factory worker who couldn't understand why wages never seemed to climb even in profitable years didn't know about the blacklist agreements and information sharing networks that suppressed wage competition between employers. The system didn't require individual villains in any dramatic sense. It only required that the people with the power to set the rules set them in their own interest, which they did, reliably, because who wouldn't? What was accumulating beneath the surface of daily American life in 1870 would eventually find its release. In the great labour upheavals of the 1880s, in the populist movement of the 1890s, in the progressive era reforms of the early 20th century. But in 1870, the pressure was still building. The people being ground up by the machine were isolated from each other by geography, language, race, and the sheer exhaustion of surviving. Too dispersed, too overworked, too divided along the lines the system conveniently provided to act together at the scale the situation actually required. The people running the system were counting on exactly that. And somewhere above the factory floors and the coal chutes and the farming counties, in offices most ordinary Americans would never see, in rooms where the actual decisions were being made, the men who controlled the economic machinery of 1870 America were making choices whose full implications nobody outside those rooms was permitted to know. Cigar smoke, aged leather, the faint metallic smell of freshly printed stock certificates. That was the atmosphere of the rooms where 1870 America was actually governed. Not the Senate chamber, not the courthouses, not the executive offices that appeared in official portraits. The rooms that mattered in 1870 were the private offices of the great railroad executives, the mahogany-panelled dining rooms of private clubs where industrial magnates discussed freight rates over brandy, and the exchange floors where fortunes were built and wiped out by men who understood that the rules constraining other people's lives were primarily tools of advantage for those sophisticated enough to use them. America in 1870 had a government on paper and a government in practice. The distance between them was roughly the thickness of a railroad company's annual report. On September 24th, 1869, Black Friday as it came to be known, Jay Gould and James Fisk attempted to corner the entire gold market of the United States. They'd spent months cultivating exactly the right relationships inside the Ulysses S. Grant administration, channeling money toward the president's brother-in-law in exchange for assurances that the Treasury Department would not sell government gold into the market. That single move was the one thing that could break the scheme. The plan nearly worked. Gold prices surged from $130 to $164 in a matter of hours, devastating speculators who'd taken short positions and threatening to destabilize businesses across the country that depended on gold-backed credit just to function day to day. Then Grant understood what was happening. He ordered the Treasury to release its gold. The price collapsed. Gould and Fisk, having quietly sold their positions near the peak, walked away largely intact. The merchants and brokers and investors caught in the middle lost everything. This happened in September 1869. By 1870, not one person who designed the scheme had faced any meaningful legal accountability. Jay Gould was 33 years old in 1870. He was already in control of the Erie Railroad, seized through a campaign of stock manipulation and legal maneuvering so brazen it had produced its own extended newspaper scandal, known as the Erie War. In that conflict, Gould and his partners had literally bribed members of the New York State Legislature to legalize stock they had issued illegally. Their opponent, Cornelius Vanderbilt, was simultaneously bribing the courts to rule against them. Both sides paid everyone they could reach. Gould's side won. By 1870, he was already positioning himself for what would eventually become control of large portions of the Western Railroad network, significant influence over the telegraph system through his acquisition of Western Union, and ownership of the elevated rail lines running through New York City. Among people who understood what he was doing, he wasn't considered an aberration. He was considered a particularly effective practitioner of methods that were broadly shared. The difference between Jay Gould and most of his peers was a matter of scale and audacity, not of fundamental approach. Boss Tweed, William M. Tweed, the head of Tammany Hall, was simultaneously at the peak of his power over New York City government, and the scale of what he'd built deserves to be understood fully before it's condemned. The Tweed Ring had been systematically draining the city treasury for years through a mechanism that was almost elegant in its design. Every vendor doing business with the city was required to overbill by a specified percentage. The excess flowed quietly to the ring. The courthouse New York was constructing in 1870 had already cost $13 million, more than the entire Alaska purchase. The contractor supplying thermometers billed $7,500. The plasterer submitted invoices approaching $3 million for work that, if it had actually been performed at that volume, would have coated every surface of the building in several feet of plaster. These weren't accounting errors. The machine was operating exactly as it was designed to. And yet, Tammany worked for people. This is the part of the hidden layer that resists easy judgment. Tweed's machine provided things to its constituents, overwhelmingly Irish Catholic immigrants and their families, that no other institution in the city was offering. Jobs on city projects, help navigating a bureaucracy built by and for people who already had money and spoke English, assistance when a family was in trouble, food, bail, a connection to someone who could make things move. The machine was corrupt. The machine was also real, and the people who depended on it were, in many cases, the same people whose taxes were being stolen to fund it. Tammany Hall in 1870 was a genuine civic institution built on top of a massive ongoing fraud, and the two things weren't separable. You couldn't have the services without the corruption. That was the arrangement. The political corruption of the Grant administration, and there was a great deal of it, more than Grant understood and more than his defenders have sometimes been willing to acknowledge, wasn't simply a failure of character in one executive branch. It was the expression of a system in which the line between public authority and private interest had been drawn so imprecisely that men of ordinary ambition couldn't always tell where legitimate influence ended and criminal bribery began. The Credit Mobilier scandal, in which the construction company building the Union Pacific Railroad had distributed shares to congressmen who then voted on legislation directly affecting that railroad, was being assembled in 1870 and would break publicly in 1872. It would implicate members of Congress from both parties and one sitting vice president. The details were complicated. The structure was simple. The people with money to distribute distributed it to the people with the power to help them, and both groups called it normal business. What ordinary Americans in 1870 couldn't know, because the financial press was in many cases financially entangled with the very figures it was ostensibly covering, and because large corporations deliberately cultivated opacity, was the degree to which the conditions of their daily lives were being actively shaped by choices made in a handful of private rooms in New York and Washington. The farmer in Iowa, who couldn't understand why shipping his grain cost more every year, didn't know about the informal freight rate agreements between competing railroad lines that functioned as cartels. The merchant who watched his bank collapse without warning didn't know about the credit manipulation that had drained the bank's real capital months before the failure was ever announced. The factory worker who couldn't understand why his wages never rose in years when the company reported record profits didn't know about the cost accounting that made labour the primary variable the company adjusted to protect its margins. The robber barons, and that term was entering circulation in exactly this period, used by critics trying to find language adequate to what they were watching, were doing something more consequential than simple theft. They were constructing the architecture of an economic system. The corporate structures they pioneered in the 1870s, the holding company, the trust arrangement, the complex layered ownership designed to extract profit while pushing liability downward onto workers and upward to investors. These are the direct ancestors of the corporate structures that shape economic life today. The railroad networks they built, however ruthlessly, are still, in substantially modified form, the freight infrastructure of the United States. The decisions made in the 1870s about the relationship between private capital and public authority shape the regulatory debates that have continued in various forms for 150 years since. The hidden layer in 1870 America wasn't hidden in any conspiratorial sense. It wasn't a secret that railroad companies were setting exploitative rates, or that politicians were available to the highest offer, or that the gap between the wealthy and everyone else was growing wider by the year. These things were reported, argued about, complained about in newspapers, in legislative chambers, and in the letters ordinary Americans wrote to each other. What was hidden was something harder to name, the sense that things could be any other way. The possibility of a different arrangement of economic power that most people simply couldn't picture, because the arrangement they lived inside had been present for the entirety of their conscious lives. The genius of the hidden layer in 1870 America wasn't secrecy. It was the successful naturalization of conditions that were chosen, maintained, and entirely alterable. They just hadn't been altered yet. The question, growing more urgent as the decade wore on, was who would do the altering, and at what cost. The smell of fresh printer's ink was everywhere in the reform world of 1870, in the cramped offices of labour newspapers, in the church basements where freed people's aid societies kept their records and planned their next moves, in the print shops turning out the pamphlets and broadsides through which political arguments travelled across a country too large and too scattered for any other medium to reach consistently. Paper was cheap. An argument that could be printed could be carried into a factory, into a rural post office, into the hands of someone who'd never been anywhere near the city where the argument originated. And in 1870, the The arguments were multiplying faster than the presses could keep up with them, because the contradictions of the era had grown too large and too daily to process alone. Mary Hallock in her boarding house room wasn't part of the organised reform world. She wasn't attending suffragist conventions or labour meetings. She was doing something quieter, and in the long run, equally consequential. She was refusing to stop being a professional. She kept her illustration commissions after the engagement to Arthur Foote was announced. She kept developing her craft, taking on more complex assignments, building a professional reputation she understood, with the clarity of someone who had thought carefully about her own situation. As the most durable form of protection available to a woman in 1870 America, if she brought genuine economic value, if editors needed her specifically, she retained some leverage in a world that otherwise systematically reduced women's leverage to zero the moment they entered a marriage. She didn't write manifestos about this. She just kept working. And in doing so, she practiced one of the most common and least celebrated forms of resistance available to women of her time: the quiet, daily insistence on continuing to be a full person inside a culture that asked women to consent to a partial one. The organised resistance was louder, more visible, and in 1870 deeply fractured in ways that produced real and lasting costs. The women's suffrage movement had split the year before into two separate organisations. The National Woman Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, was furious about the 15th Amendment's exclusion of women and willing to say so in terms that produced significant discomfort and, at times, rhetoric that drew on racial hierarchy in ways that remained genuinely troubling. The American Woman Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, had chosen to accept the 15th Amendment as a partial step forward and pursue women's suffrage state by state, a more patient strategy, less inflammatory, and in some respects more tactically grounded. Both organisations believed in women's suffrage. They disagreed about what it was acceptable to sacrifice or overlook on the way to achieving it. That disagreement wasn't trivial, and it didn't resolve quickly. The black communities of the South in 1870 were producing leaders at every level, not only the senators and congressmen making national headlines, but the local preachers, teachers, and organisers building the quiet infrastructure of black civic life under conditions of sustained, organised threat. These were people doing extraordinary things inside the texture of ordinary daily existence. The teacher who reopened her school the week after it was burned, having received no assurance it wouldn't be burned again, because the children needed to learn to read, and she was the person who could teach them. The community organiser who kept organising after being beaten, warned, and beaten again, because the alternative to organising was accepting conditions that simply weren't acceptable. These weren't people who appear in the standard heroic narrative of American history, which tends to reserve its place of honour for battlefield courage and legislative achievement. They were doing something quieter and arguably harder, building durable institutions and circumstances specifically designed to prevent exactly that. The labour resistance of 1870 had its dramatic moments: strikes, public confrontations, mass gatherings that drew thousands of workers from factories and mines across entire regions. But the more common form of resistance was harder to see: the deliberate slowing of work pace when wages were too low to justify full effort, the decision to report an injury rather than hide it and keep going, which was what employers quietly expected, the networks of information sharing among workers, which employers were fair, which were dangerous, which foremen were humane, and which were looking for reasons to cut your pay. These weren't the stories that made it into labour histories. They were the texture of daily dignity in conditions designed to make dignity expensive. And they were practiced by millions of ordinary people who didn't think of themselves as resistors at all, only as people trying to hold on to something worth holding. The women working in industrial settings who tried to organise in 1870 faced layers of resistance their male counterparts didn't. The mainstream labour movement of the era was built largely around the concept of the male breadwinner wage, the idea that a man's earnings should be sufficient to support a family, which implicitly treated women in the workforce as temporary, as people who'd eventually leave and therefore didn't need to be organised. This meant that women who genuinely needed organising, because they were permanent workers who couldn't afford to leave because they had no one to support them, because what they were paid wasn't enough to live on, often found that the organisations theoretically built to represent workers didn't consider them central to the work. The women's labour organisations that did exist in 1870 were small, underfunded and treated by the press with a mixture of condescension and amusement that revealed just how unsettling the idea of organised working women was to an arrangement most people had long since accepted as natural. Frederick Douglass was doing a particular kind of resisting in 1870 that deserves its own moment. He was insisting in public, in print, on the full complexity of what he'd seen and what he knew, at a time when the easier path would have been to celebrate the 15th Amendment as a victory and quietly set the complications aside. He did celebrate it. He said it was a genuine achievement and meant every word. And then, in the same breath, in the same editorial, he began laying out precisely why that celebration would need to be followed immediately by more work, more vigilance, more organised resistance to the forces already moving to make the constitutional guarantee meaningless in practice. This wasn't cynicism. It was the clear-eyed pragmatism of a man who'd spent 30 years watching this country make promises and then find ways to honour the letter while quietly breaking the spirit, and who had decided that the accurate accounting was more useful to the people he was writing for than the comfortable one. The farmers of the Midwest and the Great Plains were, in 1870, just beginning to develop the political vocabulary for what they were living through. The Grange, the Patrons of Husbandry, had been founded in 1867 as a social and fraternal organisation for farming families. But by 1870, it was beginning to develop a sharper political edge, driven by the railroad freight rate crisis. Farmers were starting to understand, however imperfectly and incompletely, that their individual struggles with freight costs, credit and commodity prices weren't personal failures, weren't the result of their own insufficient effort or intelligence, but were structural outcomes of a system designed to extract value from agricultural production and concentrate it in financial and transportation capital. That understanding, once it formed, was the prerequisite for collective action. It was beginning to form in 1870. The full consequences of it would arrive in the following decade. The survival happening in 1870 America was mostly quiet. It was the mother who kept a careful record of every cent spent and every cent earned, who balanced the household accounts each week with the precision of a woman who understood that the difference between a difficult month and genuine disaster was very small. It was the formerly enslaved man who registered to vote after being turned away, who walked back to the polling place and stood in line again, who voted when they finally let him through, and walked home and told his children he'd voted. It was the immigrant woman who arrived speaking no English, and within 5 years had learned enough to navigate a city, negotiate her own wages, and write a letter home that the neighbour's child could read aloud to her family in the village she'd left behind. These weren't the dramatic gestures that make history easy to narrate. They were the actual substance of survival, and of the slow, stubborn, unglamorous work of refusing to let an indifferent world take everything you had. Mary Hallock, at her drawing table, was part of this. She didn't know it. She wouldn't have described herself that way. She was just working, just building a life, piece by careful piece, just insisting on being good at something and being compensated for it. But the insisting mattered. It It always did. The country wasn't going to resolve its contradictions in 1870. The fight for labour rights, for women's suffrage, for racial equality, for basic economic dignity, all of it was going to continue for decades in patterns of advance and retreat that made the arc of progress feel anything but certain from the inside. But the resistance that made eventual progress possible was happening in 1870, in the choices of people who had no guarantee that their choices would add up to anything, and who made them anyway. What happened next, because of those choices and despite every force working against them, turned out to be more complicated and more consequential than anyone alive in 1870 could have fully anticipated. The weight of a silver dollar in the palm, that specific heft, the cool, smooth feel of milled edges against the thumb, the faint ring it made against a wooden counter. Currency in 1870 was a physical thing, present in the body in a way that digital transactions make almost impossible to recall. Money had mass. You knew exactly how much you had because you could count it, hold it, feel the difference between a full week's wages and an empty one. And yet the forces that determined what that dollar was actually worth, what it could buy, how far it could carry a family through a month, were no more visible to the person holding it in 1870 than the interest rate decisions of the Federal Reserve are visible to someone tapping a card at the grocery store today. The dollar was real. The system producing its value was almost entirely out of sight. Here's a number worth sitting with. In 1870, the wealthiest 1% of Americans owned approximately 27% of the country's total wealth. Here's another. In 2023, that same top 1% owned approximately 31%. The distance between those two figures is 150 years of history, the labour movement, 2 world wars, the New Deal, the Great Society, the longest economic expansion in American history. And the net shift in wealth concentration is 4 percentage points. This isn't an argument that nothing has changed. Enormous things have changed. Workers have legal protections. Children are in school instead of coal mines. Women can vote, hold property, sign contracts in their own names. But the underlying tendency of market economies to pull gains toward capital rather than labour, that structural gravity, turns out to be remarkably difficult to permanently reverse. The company town of 1870 has present-day echoes worth examining honestly, without the comfort of thinking them safely distant. The gig economy model that became dominant in the 2000s and 2000s shares structural DNA with the company town, even though no physical town is involved. A worker classified as an independent contractor rather than an employee can't organise under most existing labour law, doesn't receive employer-provided benefits, and is subject to algorithmic management systems that set pay and working conditions without any process of negotiation or appeal. The platform decides who works, what they earn, when they're active, and on what terms. If the algorithm flags the account for deactivation, the worker's recourse is essentially nothing. The worker owns their tools, but the company controls the conditions so completely that the independence is a legal classification more than an economic reality. The company town didn't need walls or a company store. It just needed control. The healthcare comparison may be the starkest of all. In 1870, the most common causes of death were infectious diseases spreading through contaminated water and air, surgical conditions that couldn't be safely treated before antiseptic technique and reliable anesthesia were only just entering American practice, and childbirth complications in an era with no effective intervention for the most common causes of maternal death. Ordinary Americans had no meaningful access to anything resembling modern medicine. The life expectancy numbers make that plain. The United States in 2025 has medical technology that would have seemed extraordinary to anyone who practiced medicine in 1870. It also has a healthcare system that, by any international comparison, leaves a larger share of its population without adequate access to that technology than any comparable wealthy nation. Not because the technology doesn't exist, but because the financial structure around it creates barriers that health alone cannot dissolve. The mechanism has changed entirely. The pattern, dying from things that don't have to kill you, for reasons that are primarily economic rather than medical, is more persistent than the mechanism would suggest. The immigration debate that has defined American politics for the past decade would be, in its emotional and rhetorical shape, almost immediately familiar to someone who lived through the 1870s. The arguments being made about immigrants today, that they depress wages, that they don't assimilate, that they bring disorder, that they're culturally incompatible in ways that make their inclusion dangerous, were made with the same conviction and roughly the same evidentiary basis about the Irish in the 1850s, about Chinese workers in the 1870s, about Italians, Poles, and Eastern European Jews in the 1880s and 1890s, the Irish immigrants depicted in the popular press of 1870 as constitutionally unfit for self-governance were, within a generation, producing mayors, senators, and military commanders. The cycle of exclusion and partial inclusion has been one of the most consistent patterns in American social history, with the terms of inclusion always more favourable to some groups than others, and always most fiercely contested by the groups most recently included against the groups most recently arriving. The rural-urban divide shaping American political life right now was equally present in 1870, and equally misunderstood by both sides of it. The farmer who felt the city didn't see him, didn't value the labour that fed the country, was extracting from him while returning very little. That farmer was making an accurate observation in 1870 about freight rate systems, commodity markets, and the credit conditions he was navigating every season. The city resident who felt that rural people were resistant to progress, holding the country back from a more modern future, was making an observation that also had some basis in fact, while spectacularly failing to ask whose version of progress was being proposed and at whose expense it would be carried out. The divide isn't new. What's changed is the political vocabulary and the media environment through which it gets expressed. The underlying tensions have held the same shape for 150 years. Frederick Douglass said, in the years around 1870, something that hasn't lost its accuracy with the passage of time. He said the American nation had never been compelled to fully reckon with the accumulated costs and consequences of slavery, and that until it did, those costs would keep presenting themselves in new forms, demanding payment that kept being deferred. The forms have been various in the century and a half since. The systematic terror of Jim Crow, the economic exclusions quietly built into New Deal programs, the disparate impacts of mass incarceration, the persistent wealth gap that compounds across generations. What Douglass was describing was a structural accounting problem, a society that had taken on an enormous moral and economic debt and chosen to defer rather than discharge it. Deferred debts have a way of compounding. The bill keeps arriving, in different envelopes, with a larger amount on the invoice each time. The question this history puts directly to the present doesn't resolve comfortably. If you had been living in 1870, which of that world's injustices would you have seen clearly enacted against, and which ones would you have accepted as simply the way things are? Unfortunate, perhaps, regrettable, but natural or inevitable, or not quite your immediate problem. The honest answer, for most people in most historical periods, is that the injustices most clearly seen and most actively resisted are the ones that press directly on your own life. The ones that feel inevitable are the ones operating at a comfortable distance from personal experience, or that benefit, in visible or invisible ways, the person tempted to look away. The coal mine owner who'd never been inside a coal mine thought child labour was regrettable, but economically necessary. He wasn't a monster. He was a person whose comfortable distance from the mine's interior had never once been disturbed. What would we do differently? The question isn't rhetorical. There are structural conditions operating in the present with direct parallels to 1870. Concentrations of economic power shaping regulatory environments, gaps between constitutional guarantees and practical access, communities bearing costs that the people making the relevant decisions don't share. The people of 1870 mostly couldn't see those conditions clearly enough, or act on what they saw quickly enough to prevent the full weight of the consequences. Some of them could, and did. The ones who built the unions, the suffragist organisations, the black civic institutions that were systematically dismantled and rebuilt again. Those are the people who made it possible for the present to be different from the past in the specific ways it actually is. The question isn't whether the pattern is still operating. The question is who's seeing it clearly enough right now to do what needs doing. The Senate chamber in Washington smelled of tobacco, damp wool, and the particular unease of a deliberative body trying to figure out what its own most consequential recent action actually required of it. The 15th Amendment had been ratified in February 1870. Hiram revels had been seated in March, the gallery packed with black observers who'd travelled to Washington to witness it, many of them weeping openly. Not from sentimentality, from the weight of what the moment represented, and from knowing what it had cost to arrive there. The practical question now, the one driving nearly every debate in Congress through the spring and summer of 1870, was what ratification actually meant in the states where it was already being systematically violated before the ink was dry. What was the federal government prepared to do about that? How much was Congress willing to spend, politically, financially, militarily, to make the constitutional promise mean what it said? The Reconstruction debate of 1870 had two sides, and those two sides rarely engaged each other's strongest arguments. The radical Republicans believed Reconstruction required sustained federal authority, real enforcement mechanisms, real consequences for states violating constitutional guarantees, a long-term federal presence that would make it structurally impossible for the former Confederate states to simply wait out the reformers and restore the old social order by other means. They were right about what was needed. They turned out to be wrong about whether the political will to sustain it would last. Their opposition, drawn from conservative Republicans and most Democrats, argued that the South needed to manage its own affairs, that federal intervention in state governance was tyrannical, that the formerly enslaved would do best under the guidance of white Southern leadership that, they claimed, understood them. This case was made with sincerity by some of the people making it. It was catastrophically wrong about what would actually happen if it prevailed. It won anyway, over the course of the decade by attrition, exhaustion, and the gradual transfer of national attention to economic questions that felt more urgent to the people best positioned to define urgency. The women's suffrage debate was playing out simultaneously all across the country, and the arguments on both sides had a depth and texture that the eventual outcome of the fight tends to flatten into simple opposition. The case Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were making in 1870 wasn't simply that women deserved the vote as a matter of abstract equality, though they believed that. It was that democratic governance was structurally incomplete when it excluded half the adult population. That the laws shaping women's daily lives, their rights within marriage, their access to employment, education, and the courts, were being made exclusively by men who had a personal and institutional stake in maintaining exactly the arrangements those laws protected. The vote wasn't just a right, it was the mechanism for changing every other condition. The case against women's suffrage in 1870 was more varied than a simple list of opponents suggests. Some argued from religious authority that Scripture established a natural order of sex roles that democratic franchise would upend. Some argued from a theory of separate spheres, that women's influence operated through the domestic and moral world in ways that were ultimately more powerful than the coarser business of electoral politics. Some raised a more pragmatic concern that women's suffrage would reshape the electorate in ways that were unpredictable, particularly in states where newly enfranchised black voters were already threatening established power arrangements. These weren't equivalent arguments. Some were cynical, some were sincere, some managed to be both at the same time. But together, they represented a real breadth of opposition that crossed parties, regions, and social classes. The labour debate, what workers were owed and what they could legitimately demand, had reached a particular intensity in 1870 because the post-Civil War economic expansion had produced enormous visible wealth alongside conditions that made the gap between that wealth and ordinary wages impossible to explain as anything other than a deliberate choice. The 8-hour workday movement had won legislative recognition in several states by 1870, but the laws requiring 8-hour days for government workers were widely ignored. Private industry didn't bother acknowledging them at all. The National Labour Union, founded in 1866, was attempting to build a coalition across craft and industrial unions large enough to negotiate at scale. It was the most ambitious effort at a unified national labour organisation in American history up to that point. And it was already fracturing in 1870 along the fault lines of race, skill level, and deep disagreements about political strategy. The race question inside the labour movement of 1870 was a specific expression of the larger contradiction running through American progressive politics in this era. Workers had common interests, and many white workers refused to act on those common interests across racial lines. The National Labour Union officially endorsed black membership. It had essentially no black members, because the craft unions at its base excluded black workers by rule or by practice. Black workers in 1870 were forming their own organisations, the Coloured National Labour Union among them, not because they preferred separation, but because the integrated option was segregated in everything but name. The division weakened both sides, and it benefited exactly the people who had the most to gain from keeping workers apart, which was precisely what it was designed to do. The tariff debate, which consumed enormous congressional energy in 1870 and would continue to do so for decades, was a proxy war for a larger argument about what kind of economy the United States was going to become. High tariffs protected American manufacturing from foreign competition. Industrialists who needed that protection supported them. So did the workers whose jobs depended on those industries. Lower tariffs were favoured by farmers and merchants who needed affordable imported goods and wanted to export agricultural products without facing retaliatory barriers abroad. The argument had genuine economic complexity. Historians still debate the net effects of the protective tariff system on American development, and it had an additional layer of complexity in a political system where the people most able to fund campaigns tended to favour the higher rates. The policy debate and the money debate were never fully separable. What's striking about the great debates of 1870, looking back across 150 years, is how clearly many of the participants understood the structural stakes, and how consistently those stakes were obscured, deferred, or traded away in favour of what seemed achievable in the short term. The radical Republicans, who understood that Reconstruction required a generation of sustained federal commitment, weren't defeated by a better argument. They were defeated by a coalition of interests, economic, political, regional, that found the costs of that commitment more immediately painful than the costs of walking away. The suffragists, who understood that the franchise was inseparable from every other legal right, were told to wait, then told to wait again, for reasons that had less to do with the merit of the argument than with who stood to lose power if it succeeded. The workers, who understood that their wages were a political choice and not a natural outcome, were outmaneuvered by the organisational advantages of the people who'd been making that political choice for decades. The debates of 1870 didn't resolve. They continued through the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, through the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement, through the culture debates of the late 20th century and into the present. The questions about who American democracy was actually for, about what working people are owed, about how to make constitutional guarantees function in practice and not just in theory. Those questions were being asked in 1870. They're being asked right now. What's changed between then and today isn't the questions themselves. It's the vocabulary, the specific institutional forms the arguments take, the particular people doing the arguing. The underlying disputes have the continuity of geological formations. The surface shifts, weather works on it constantly, but the rock beneath is the same rock it was 150 years ago. What's being contested in this country right now, underneath the specific policy arguments, is what was being contested in 1870. The stakes were clear then. They remain clear now, for anyone willing to look directly at them. The air in the anthracite coal regions of northeastern Pennsylvania carried coal dust even on still winter days, a fine black particulate that settled on snow, on windowsills, on the faces of children who'd been indoors all day and still came to the supper table with a faint grey cast to their skin. The Molly Maguires, a secret organisation of Irish Catholic miners operating in the coalfields of Schuylkill County and the surrounding area, were entering the period of their greatest activity, their greatest violence, and their eventual destruction at the hands of a Pinkerton detective and a judicial system that, whatever the merits of the specific criminal cases, was also functioning as an instrument for dismantling mining unionism across the region. The breaking point of 1870 America wasn't a single event, it was a condition, and the coal country was where that condition was most visibly approaching its limit. The Molly Maguires weren't simply a criminal organisation, though they did commit crimes. They were the violent expression of a community that had been pushed toward extremity by conditions that would push almost any community there. Irish Catholic miners in the anthracite region in 1870 were working in mines owned predominantly by Anglo-Protestant companies, supervised by Anglo-Protestant foremen with wide discretion over which workers got the better-paying assignments. They lived in company towns where the cost of housing and provisions was set by the same company that determined their wages, and they were dying in mines whose casualty rates the companies treated as an unfortunate cost of business, not as a solvable safety problem. The Molly Maguires targeted mine supervisors and company officials identified as particularly abusive. This was vigilante violence, morally complicated, genuinely responsive to real injustice. It was also used, comprehensively, successfully, to justify the destruction of all labour organising in the region for a generation. The breaking points of 1870 took different forms in different parts of the country. In the South, it was the acceleration of clan terror against black communities and their white allies, violence calibrated to produce exactly what it was producing, the retreat of federal engagement and the restoration of white political control across the region. In the Southwest, it was the intensification of the Indian Wars, the forced removal and deliberate cultural destruction of Native American nations standing in the path of railroad construction and white settlement, carried out with the full military backing of a federal government that had decided, at the highest levels, that the human cost to the people being displaced was an acceptable price for the economic development being unlocked. In the cities, it was the emergence of an industrial poor so large and so desperate that the charitable and religious institutions trying to help couldn't come close to containing the need, producing urban conditions that reformers were only just beginning to develop the language to describe. The financial system of the United States in 1870 was approaching a breaking point that most people inside it couldn't see. The post-Civil War economy had been running on a combination of railroad construction frenzy, loose credit, and speculative investment, building a structure whose foundations were far less solid than its upper floors. The men who understood this, banking insiders and large institutional investors with access to information ordinary depositors never had, were quietly positioning themselves. The men who didn't, small investors, entrepreneurs who'd borrowed to expand, depositors who trusted their local banks, were going to find out in September 1873 when J. Cook and Company, the most prestigious banking house in America, declared bankruptcy and triggered a financial panic that collapsed the economy into a depression lasting 5 years. That disaster was already being assembled in 1870. The materials were in place. The people most likely to be destroyed by it had no way of knowing. What actually broke in 1870, what couldn't be repaired without acknowledging things most people in power preferred not to acknowledge, was the premise that the country's contradictions were manageable. For the first half of the 1860s, the Civil War had forced a genuine reckoning. The contradiction between the stated principles of the Declaration of Independence and the institution of slavery had grown too large to manage by deferral, and the country had fought itself over it in the most violent, sustained conflict in its history. The resolution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, had seemed for a brief time like it might actually constitute a reckoning. By 1870, it was becoming clear that it had constituted a deferral in new constitutional clothing. The promise was real, the enforcement was faltering, and the people who'd made the promise were already beginning to look for ways to be released from it. The natural disasters of 1870 added their own dimension of fracture. The Great Chicago Fire was still a year away, but the conditions that would make it catastrophic, a city built largely of wood, a fire department inadequate to the scale of the expansion, a real estate economy that had built cheaply and quickly and worried about fire codes afterward, were already fully in place. The Mississippi River flooded with its characteristic devastating thoroughness. Drought conditions in parts of the Great Plains were beginning to stress farming communities that had arrived on the faith of land promoters and railroad pamphlets promising conditions the landscape didn't consistently deliver. The natural world in 1870 was as indifferent to American economic narratives as it has always been, and the gap between what the promotional literature promised and what the actual land provided was a breaking point for thousands of farming families who had staked everything on the difference. The breaking point for ordinary Americans in 1870 was often a single event, one moment where the pressure of years finally collapsed into one place: a mine accident that killed the primary wage earner, a crop failure in the second consecutive dry year, a bank collapse that wiped out the only savings standing between the family and destitution. These weren't the grand historical events that tend to make it into the written record. They were the ordinary catastrophes of ordinary lives in a world without safety nets. And the response to these moments tells you something about the actual character of 1870 America that the mythologized version tends to leave out. People helped each other, imperfectly, inconsistently, with whatever resources they had, which were usually not enough. And people failed each other, often not from cruelty, but from their own exhaustion and their own precarity. The political breaking point, the moment when the bipartisan consensus supporting Reconstruction finally began to fracture, was arriving in slow motion through 1870, visible in congressional vote tallies, in newspaper editorials, in the private letters of men who'd supported the project and were beginning to calculate the cost of continuing. The Grant administration was still energetic in its support of Reconstruction in 1870. It would remain so through the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. But the liberal Republican movement was forming within the party, built around figures like Carl Schurz and Charles Francis Adams, who framed their opposition as a matter of principled anti-corruption and limited government, rather than as racial indifference, which was the somewhat more complicated truth. The fracturing of the Republican coalition over Reconstruction would become decisive in the elections of 1872 and 1876. The withdrawal of federal protection from black Southerners that followed would be one of the most consequential political betrayals in American history. In 1870, that betrayal was being prepared. It wasn't complete yet, but the preparation was underway, in the arguments being shaped in Republican newspapers, in private correspondence, and in the meeting rooms where party strategy was quietly decided. What does a country look like at the moment, just before a breaking point it doesn't know is coming? In many respects, it looks like 1870 America, prosperous in aggregate numbers that conceal enormous internal disparities, confident in a national narrative of progress that papers over unresolved contradictions, moving fast enough that the costs of the speed don't have to be examined too carefully, because the examination would slow things down, and there are places to go and things to build, and someone else will handle the accounting later. The breaking point comes anyway. It always does. The question that 1870 poses for every era that inherits it isn't whether the breaking point arrives. It's whether, when it does, enough people have been thinking honestly about the contradictions to do something useful with the rupture, rather than simply patch the surface, call it resolved, and move on. The smell of fresh sawn lumber was everywhere in the 1870s, in the new western towns being laid out along railroad lines on the Great Plains, in the neighborhoods going up in Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee to house the workers the factories needed. In the frontier settlements where families who'd bet everything on a fresh start were building the physical infrastructure of lives they were determined to make work. America in the 1870s was transforming faster than in any previous decade of its history, and that was saying something for a country that had been changing continuously since the first Europeans arrived. The pace of that transformation was industrial, but its consequences were human, felt in bodies, in families, in communities that had no choice but to adapt to what the economy was doing to the landscape of their daily lives. Mary Halleck married Arthur Foote in 1876 and followed him west, to the New Almaden quicksilver mine in the foothills south of San Jose, California, where he'd taken an engineering position. The move was the kind of upheaval that 1870s America regularly imposed on people drawn into the expanding industrial frontier. The landscape of California's coastal hills was nothing like the Hudson Valley she'd grown up near. Drier, hotter, the vegetation unfamiliar, the quality of the light entirely different from anything she'd built a visual vocabulary for. She had to learn to see it. She did, with the same deliberate attention she'd brought to everything else, and as she learned the landscape she began writing about it. Essays and stories drawn from her life inside a mining community, written with a personal precision that had nothing in common with the genre conventions of Western writing in that era. Her continuing to work after marriage was itself a small transformation, one individual instance of a larger social shift in which the definition of what a married woman's life could contain was slowly, unevenly, and resistantly changing. She hadn't stopped being a professional when she became a wife. She didn't stop when she became a mother. She wrote and illustrated through the full span of her marriage, producing work that was celebrated in her lifetime and is still in print today. This wasn't the norm for women of her class and generation, though it was less exceptional than it would have been for her mother's generation. The norms were shifting, not quickly, not without enormous resistance, not without real cost to the women trying to live outside their edges, but shifting. The transformation of Black American life in the years following 1870 was, in its full account, a story of extraordinary human capacity colliding with extraordinary structural malice. The Reconstruction governments in the South were dismantled systematically through the 1870s, through political violence, through federal abandonment, and through the Compromise of 1877 that ended the federal military presence in the South in exchange for a resolution to a disputed presidential election. What followed was the restoration of white supremacist political control that hardened into law across the region over the following decades: Jim Crow segregation, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, a comprehensive architecture of disenfranchisement that remained in place until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The men who built that architecture were the direct heirs of those who'd founded the Ku Klux Klan. The methods were different. The project was the same. The transformation of the agricultural Midwest in the years after 1870 was shaped by the very forces farmers had been struggling against: the railroad companies, the commodity markets, the credit system. But it was also shaped by the political organisation those struggles produced: the Grange, the Farmers' Alliance, and eventually the Populist Party represented the political maturation of rural communities that had learned, through painful experience, that individual virtue and hard work were insufficient responses to structural economic conditions. The Granger laws of the 1870s, state regulations of railroad freight rates, the first significant regulatory intervention in the railroad industry, were the direct result of organised political pressure from farming communities that had decided, after enough seasons of being ground up by the rate structure, that the system had to change. The transformation of American cities in the 1870s was driven by immigration at a scale the infrastructure of those cities couldn't keep pace with. The tenement house, the settlement house, the municipal water system, all were responses to an urbanization producing conditions that even the most strenuously anti-reform newspapers could see as threatening. Germ theory, finally gaining real traction in American medicine during this period, provided a scientific framework for what practical observation had long suggested: that water quality, sewage disposal, and housing density were public health matters, not personal moral failures. That reconceptualization, the shift from understanding poverty and disease as private failures to understanding them as environmental conditions that public action could actually address, was one of the most consequential intellectual shifts of the era. It would eventually produce the progressive era reforms of the early 20th century. The labour movement, beaten back repeatedly through the 1870s, transformed itself through those beatings into something more durable. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the first truly national labour conflict in American history, spreading spontaneously across the rail network from Martinsburg, West Virginia, to St. Louis, Chicago, and San Francisco, was crushed by federal and state military force with considerable violence. It was also a demonstration that working people could act in unison on a continental scale, and that demonstration wasn't forgotten. The craft unions that would eventually consolidate into the American Federation of Labor drew their organisational lessons from what had happened. The industrial unions that would reshape the country in the 1930s drew from earlier failures and adapted them. The labour movement that exists today, diminished, struggling, but present, is the direct descendant of the organising that was being crushed in the 1870s and refused to stay crushed. The West was transforming in the 1870s in ways that would shape American geography and mythology for generations. The cattle drives, the mining booms, the homestead settlements spreading across the Great Plains. All of it was producing the raw material for what would become the dominant American legend of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the frontier myth, the cowboy narrative, the story of open land, individual will, and a West that was there for the taking. The fact that the West wasn't simply available, that it was home to native peoples being violently displaced, that much of it was legally owned by railroad companies holding enormous federal land grants, that the independent rancher and the free homesteader were already being squeezed out by large corporate agricultural interests. None of that prevented the myth from forming. The myth and the reality of the West diverged from each other almost immediately in the 1870s. They've never fully converged since. America transformed between 1870 and 1900 in ways that would have been nearly impossible to foresee for anyone standing in that earlier moment, trying to picture what was coming. Electric light, the telephone, the automobile's earliest beginnings, the rise of mass consumer culture, industrial corporations organized at scales that dwarfed anything operating in 1870. The progressive movement that eventually began to regulate them. The Spanish-American War that made the United States a formal imperial power with territories stretching into the Pacific and the Caribbean. The transformation was real. It was enormous. And yet what's equally true is that it preserved, and in some cases deepened, the structural conditions that had defined everyday life in 1870 for the people at the bottom of the income and power distributions. The forms changed. The underlying arrangement of who bore the costs and who captured the benefits changed far more slowly. Mary Hallock Foote published her first novel in 1883. By the 1890s, she was one of the most prominent women writers in America, her work shaped by direct experience of the mining West that most of her Eastern readers found exotic and most of her contemporaries romanticized. She didn't romanticize it. She wrote about it plainly, with the precise observational discipline she'd been quietly developing since those early mornings at the drawing table in the boarding house on East 15th Street. The young woman who'd kept working in 1870, who'd refused to stop being a professional when the culture around her expected her to, had become someone whose work outlasted the culture that had expected her to stop. That's the transformation arc in miniature. The resistance that didn't look like resistance turns out over time to be the most durable kind. There's a sound that runs through the entire history of 1870 America if you listen for it. It's the sound of people trying to locate themselves inside a system moving faster than they can track. Not confusion exactly. Confusion implies not knowing what's happening. Many of the people most affected by the transformations of this era understood quite precisely what was happening to them. The sound is something closer to a specific kind of dissonance. Knowing a thing clearly and being structurally prevented from acting on that knowledge at the scale the situation actually requires. It's the sound of accurate perception meeting inadequate power, repeated. Across a wide variety of contexts, communities, and individual lives, it's one of the most human sounds imaginable, and it produced, over decades of repetition, a wisdom that the era didn't always get credit for generating. The discovery this history makes, and it is a discovery, not a lesson applied from the outside because it emerges from the particulars of the people and the events, is something like this. The most consequential choices of 1870 America were made not in the dramatic moments, but in the ordinary ones. not in the congressional battles and the court decisions and the great strikes and the famous speeches, though all of those mattered. The choices that shaped the most were the quiet, daily ones, about what to treat as fixed and what to treat as changeable, what to accept as the nature of things, and what to resist as a choice that could simply be made differently. That distinction between the nature of things and the choices embedded in arrangements that have come to feel natural turns out to be the most practically useful form of intelligence available to anyone who wants to change the world they're living in. The farmers who eventually built the Grange and the populist movement didn't do it because they suddenly discovered that the freight rate system was unjust. They'd known it was unjust for years. What changed was their relationship to the belief that the injustice was fixed, that the railroad's pricing power was as immutable as the weather, as unchallengeable as the turning of seasons. The wisdom they developed, slowly, through failure and defeat, through the humbling discovery that individual virtue wasn't sufficient to the problem, was the recognition that a system built from human choices could be changed by different human choices, applied collectively and at sufficient scale. This sounds simple. It cost decades of painful experience to learn. There were many people in many eras who never learned it, and their children and grandchildren had to learn it again from the beginning. Mary Hallock Foot's particular wisdom was different in kind but connected in spirit. She learned, across the decades of her career, that the condition most hostile to good work isn't difficulty, or hardship, or even the specific structural injustices that constrained her options. It's the internalization of those constraints as permanent limitations on the self, the moment when what the world says you can't be becomes what you believe you can't be. She never fully made that surrender. She kept the part of herself that belonged to the work separate from the part that had to navigate the social and legal arrangements of marriage and gender in that era. This wasn't heroic in any dramatic sense. It was just stubbornly maintained against the considerable pressure of a culture that had very firm ideas about where a married woman's attention should be directed. That quiet maintenance of the distance between the socially acceptable self and the fully capable self was both her survival strategy and her greatest achievement. The wisdom available from the Black American experience of 1870 is perhaps the most complex and the most practically hard one of any. It's the wisdom of people who had to develop simultaneously the capacity to resist the arrangement they were living inside and the capacity to build institutions, churches, schools, newspapers, fraternal organizations, political coalitions that could sustain the community through the periods when resistance was being crushed and rebuilding was the only option left. This alternation between pushing for change and maintaining the internal structures that made survival possible when change was being blocked is an organizational and psychological achievement that deserves far more serious attention than it typically receives. Here is what the calendar of 1870 teaches about the relationship between individual character and structural conditions. Character matters enormously, and character alone is not enough. The workers being exploited in 1870 weren't exploited because they lacked character. Most of them had more physical endurance, more ingenuity under constraint, more practical daily courage than most of the people above them in the economic hierarchy. What they lacked was structural power, the organized capacity to make the costs of exploitation fall on the people doing the exploiting, rather than exclusively on the people being exploited. Character is the necessary foundation. Organization is the building. You need both. In 1870, America was still in the early stages of learning what the building required. The wisdom about governance that 1870 generates is uncomfortable but important. The distance between what a constitutional text says and what it actually delivers in practice is determined primarily by who has the power to enforce it, and whether they have the will. The 14th and 15th Amendments were extraordinary documents. They were also almost immediately stripped of practical meaning in the states where they mattered most, by people who understood that paper rights and enforced rights were two very different things, and that the difference between them was political power, not legal language. This is a lesson every generation has to learn for itself, because every generation inherits constitutional promises and discovers at some point that those promises require active maintenance to remain real. The specific wisdom that 1870 America earned the hard way, and that the present keeps having to rediscover, is that systems designed to serve the interests of the people who designed them don't reform themselves. They require external pressure, sustained over time, applied at sufficient scale to make the cost of maintaining the system higher than the cost of changing it. This is true of railroad freight rate structures, it's true of workplace safety conditions, it's true of voting rights, it's true of environmental regulations, it's true of every area in which the gap between the arrangement that benefits the most powerful and the arrangement that serves the most people has had to be negotiated rather than assumed. The negotiation is the ongoing work of democratic life. In 1870, the people most affected by the worst arrangements were just beginning to develop the organizational tools to conduct that negotiation at scale. It took decades. It took lives. It produced results. The results were impermanent. The work started again. What this history refuses to offer is a comfortable destination, a moment of resolution where the tension finally breaks, the right side wins, the wisdom is confirmed, and everyone can rest. 1870. America doesn't give you that. What it gives you instead is something more honest. A demonstration that the people who changed things for the better were not, for the most part, people who could see clearly to the end of the process they were starting. They were people who could see clearly enough, who understood the next necessary step without any guarantee of what would follow, and who took that step anyway. The courage required wasn't the courage of certainty. It was the courage of moving forward without it. That's the wisdom 1870 America earned at genuine cost, and it's exactly as relevant now as it was then. There's a moment in the evening of an ordinary day in 1870 America, not a dramatic moment, not historically significant by any external measure, when the fire has been fed and the children have been settled and the dishes have been cleared and the lamp has been lit, and a person finally sits down with a few minutes of something approaching quiet and thinks, not about history, not about the forces reshaping their world, about the particular texture of this day, this week, this life, about the letter that arrived from a sister in Ohio, about whether the cough that started last month is something to worry about what the spring planting ought to look like if the prices don't recover. These private moments, ordinary, unglamorous, stripped of any historical weight, are the actual substance of what it meant to be alive in 1870 America. They're worth holding, because they connect us to those people in ways that political narrative and economic analysis don't quite reach. The identity that 1870 America was building, the collective American self emerging from the collision of industrial capitalism, immigration, emancipation, westward expansion, and urbanization, was genuinely new. Nothing quite like it had existed before. The country taking shape in 1870 was the first experiment at this particular scale and complexity, a continental nation attempting democracy with a population drawn from more linguistic and cultural traditions than had ever been assembled under a single government, trying to absorb the aftermath of the most violent internal conflict in its history while simultaneously expanding its territory and remaking its entire economy. The experiment had no template. The people inside it were building it as they went, from available materials with whatever intelligence, courage, stubbornness, and occasional cruelty they brought to the work. What emerged from that making, and what we're the inheritors of, in ways more intimate and specific than the general language of national inheritance tends to suggest, is a particular American character, not a uniform one. The diversity of 1870, America produced a diversity of responses and adaptations and identities that the singular noun American flattens dangerously. But some tendencies that cut across that diversity are real enough to name. The tendency toward improvisation, toward solving the immediate problem with what's available, rather than waiting for ideal conditions that may never arrive. The tendency toward collective action that doesn't announce itself as collective action, the barn raising understood as neighborliness rather than politics, the mutual aid society understood as religious community rather than labor organizing, the tendency toward optimism about the next place, the next season, the next start, even after the current place and season and start have failed. These aren't virtues in themselves. They can produce denial just as easily as resilience, and the optimism about the next place has been used to justify an enormous amount of displacement. But they're real, and they're ours. The Americans of 1870 were building an identity partly by deciding what they weren't. They weren't European aristocracy. They decided that explicitly and deliberately, even as the industrial economy quietly reproduced aristocratic conditions of wealth and labour in new forms. Many of them weren't willing to be what the immigrants they encountered were, or what the formerly enslaved were, or what Native Americans were. The violence of that refusal shaped the culture in ways that are still being worked through. The national identity being forged in 1870 had enormous exclusions built into its construction. Those exclusions weren't accidental or peripheral. In many cases, they were constitutive. The American identity being assembled in that era defined itself partly by what it was willing to do to the people it refused to include. And yet, here's the complication that makes 1870 America something other than simply a cautionary tale. The people being excluded were also shaping what America was becoming. The African-American intellectual and cultural traditions developing in the decades following emancipation produced, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, an outpouring of artistic and intellectual achievement that shaped American culture in ways the mainstream was initially reluctant to acknowledge. The immigrant communities carrying their languages, their food, their music, their organizational traditions into American cities were transforming those cities in ways that would eventually be celebrated as the very richness of American life. The Native American peoples who survived the genocidal pressure of westward expansion preserve cultural traditions that continue to enrich the broader American inheritance. The contributions of the people most aggressively excluded from the American identity of 1870 are among the most significant components of what America actually became. What does this mean for us, for the people alive right now, inheriting a country that was being built and contested and fought over in 1870? It means, at minimum, that the inheritance is complicated in a way that simple pride and simple shame both fail to capture. The country we live in was built by people who did things we'd recognize as heroic and things we'd recognize as monstrous, often simultaneously, often in the same year, sometimes in the same person. The heroism was real. The courage of people building lives under conditions designed to prevent them from building lives. The persistence of people insisting on rights the culture was actively working to deny them. The quiet daily labour of making something worth making from very limited materials. The monstrousness was also real. The organised violence of Reconstruction's dismantling. The systematic exploitation of children in industrial workplaces. The dispossession of native peoples through military force and legal sleight of hand. Both are ours to account for. The collective identity that 1870 America was generating isn't finished generating. It's still being made right now by the choices being made in public and in private by people who are inside the process the same way the people of 1870 were inside it. Too close to see the full shape, too occupied with the immediate to fully assess the long-term consequences. The American identity of the present is being assembled from decisions being made about who gets counted and who gets protected, whose contribution gets acknowledged and whose gets overlooked. These are the same questions being decided in 1870. The decisions made then still shape the decisions available now, and the decisions made now will shape the options available to the people who come after us, who'll look back at this period with whatever mixture of gratitude and unease we bring to looking back at 1870. The people of 1870 didn't think of themselves as historical. They thought of themselves as the present, as the normal, the contemporary, the simply real. They had no way of knowing that the choices they were making, the compromises they were accepting, the injustices they were perpetuating, and the others they were fighting, would look as clear and consequential as they now do from a distance of 150 years. This is the most humbling thing 1870 America teaches us about our own moment. We're also making choices that will look clear and consequential from a distance we can't reach from inside the present. The question isn't whether those choices matter. They manifestly do. The question is whether we're making them with the honesty and the care that the weight of the moment requires. The people of 1870 mostly weren't. Some of them were. The difference between those who were and those who weren't turned out to be enormously consequential for the world that followed. Mary Hallock Foote died in 1938, at the age of 91, in Grass Valley, California. She'd been born in 1847 into a world of candles and hand looms and horses. She died in a world of radio broadcasts, automobiles, and the first commercial airlines. In the span of a single long human life, she'd watched the entire industrial transformation of America from the inside. Watched the country being argued into existence in 1870 become something that neither its admirers nor its sharpest critics in that year could have precisely predicted. She wrote 12 novels and numerous short stories and essays. She illustrated dozens of books and magazines. And she produced a memoir, not published until 1972, 34 years after her death, that remains one of the most honest and beautifully rendered accounts of what it meant to live as a woman of intelligence and ambition inside the constraints of the 19th century American West. She made something durable from the life available to her. She didn't make everything she might have made in different circumstances. Almost no one does. The question her life poses, and that 1870 America poses more broadly, isn't whether the people of that era were better or worse than we are. They were, in the ways that matter most, indistinguishable from us, capable of courage and pettiness in roughly equal measure, driven by interests and beliefs they understood imperfectly, making choices whose full consequences they couldn't anticipate. The real question is what the distance between 1870 and the present reveals about the relationship between what we are and what we're capable of becoming, and what the gap between those two things costs. Consider the geography of daily life in 1870 America. Most Americans lived within 20 miles of their birthplace. Most had never seen a city larger than the nearest market town. The world they inhabited was, by any measure of physical space, deeply local, bounded by what a horse could cover in a day, by what the roads permitted, by the reach of relationships formed early in life and rarely extended much further. And yet the forces shaping that intensely local life, the railroad freight rates, the commodity prices, the credit terms, the political decisions being made in Washington, were anything but local. They were national, and in the case of the gold market and the railroad bond market, international. The ordinary farmer in 1870 was living a local life inside a global system he had almost no capacity to perceive or influence. This wasn't confusion on his part, it was the nature of the system. We live, in the present, inside a structure of similar character and vastly greater geographic scale. The forces shaping our daily lives, the algorithms setting the prices of things we consume, the supply chain decisions determining what's available when, the financial instruments linking a drought in one hemisphere to a grocery bill in another, are global in a way that would have been conceptually imaginable to the economists of 1870, but materially far beyond anything they experienced. We can name the forces shaping our daily lives more precisely than the farmers of 1870 could name theirs. Whether we can influence them more effectively is a different question entirely, and a genuinely open one. What 1870, America keeps insisting on from its distance of 150 years is that the conditions of daily life, who works how many hours for what wages, who has access to clean water and adequate food and medical care, who gets to vote and who gets protected by the law they voted for, these are not natural phenomena. They're the accumulated consequences of choices. Choices made by people who were inside a system and chose to maintain it, or to change it, or to look away from it at the moment when looking required seeing something too costly to acknowledge. The conditions of 1870 looked natural to most of the people living inside them. They weren't natural, they were chosen. And in being chosen, they were also changeable, though the changing cost more than anyone who benefited from the existing arrangement was willing to pay without significant external pressure. The external pressure came, eventually, not in 1870, not fully, not at the scale the contradictions demanded. It came in stages, over decades, at great cost to the people who provided it. The labour organisers beaten and blacklisted and occasionally killed. The suffragists imprisoned and force-fed and publicly ridiculed across 2 generations of advocacy. The civil rights activists murdered and bombed and legally harassed across a full century of organising. The pressure changed things, not everything. Not as much as the people applying it needed it to, but enough that the world of the present, for all its failures and genuine injustices, is materially different from the world of 1870 in ways that matter enormously to the people who would have borne the worst of what 1870 had to offer. The coal country children who don't work in mines anymore, the women who can vote and own property and practice medicine and law, the black Americans who can, in legal principle and often in practice, vote, hold office, own property, and receive the equal protection of the law. These aren't small things. They represent the accumulated work of generations of people who saw the gap between what the country said it was and what it actually delivered, decided that gap wasn't acceptable, and organised to close it. They succeeded imperfectly, they succeeded enough to matter, and they did it without any guarantee, available to none of them at the time, that the work would produce results they'd live to see. What do we owe the people of 1870? The ones who endured, the ones who resisted, the ones who built, in conditions designed to prevent building, something that outlasted the conditions. We owe them accuracy, at minimum, the honest account of what they lived, what they fought against, what they built and what they failed to build, and why the failure was sometimes the system, sometimes themselves, and usually some uncategorizable mixture of both. We owe them the refusal to reduce them to symbols, either of American greatness or of American shame, because they were neither. They were people, and we owe ourselves the honesty that their story demands. The honesty to ask which conditions of the present, which arrangements that feel natural and permanent and simply the way things are, will look to the people of 2170, the way the child labour of the coal mines looks to us now. Not as natural conditions, as chosen ones, maintained past the point of any legitimate justification by people who found them comfortable or profitable or simply too familiar to examine. That question doesn't have a comfortable answer. It doesn't have any answer at all that doesn't require looking directly at something we'd rather keep just out of sight. The people of 1870 mostly didn't look. The ones who did are the ones who made it possible for the present to be different from the past. Mary Hallock Foote, at the drawing table in the boarding house room, pulling the Baron slowly across Boxwood in the morning light. She was making an image of the world as she saw it, with as much honesty as the forms available to her permitted. That's all any of us can do. The forms change. The obligation doesn't. Somewhere right now, someone is sitting with a choice that will look, from a sufficient distance, as clear and consequential as the choices of 1870 look to us. The distance is the only thing that makes them easy to see. Up close, they look like just another ordinary morning. They always do. In 1870, even something as simple as washing clothes could take an entire day by hand, water drawn and heated piece by piece. Life moved slowly, but it asked a quiet kind of endurance from everyone who lived it. If this small window into their world stayed with you, that's enough for bedtime sleepy. Sleep gently now.